Okay, but like, look at this face. Doesn't it evoke mid-2000s era DeviantArt? Does it not call to mind the legions of anime fangirls from the early aughts who had Inuyasha as one of their main personality traits? Hi, I'm Will. I'm a game developer. Let's play some Japanese games. Kaisoku Tenshi, subtitled high-tension comical action game The Rapid Angel, is a 1998 PS1 beat-em-up that was never released outside of Japan. In it, you play one of three women, Natsumi, Ayane, or Haruna, who work for the titular Kaisoku Tenshi, a postal service, as they try to complete their most dangerous delivery yet. Honestly, I don't fully know how I'd localize this title. Kaisoku Tenshi I think is supposed to evoke the vibe of a delivery company's name, and the very literal Rapid Angel doesn't really feel right to me personally. Angel Express, as in express delivery, would almost be good, except it sounds more like it's about trains, and the reverse, Express Angel, kind of misses the mark for me too. Anyway, I'm just going to call it Tenshi for the rest of the video. Before I talk about the actual gameplay of Tenshi, I suppose we might as well address what is likely the most immediately noteworthy and entertaining aspect of the game, its art style. Some Japanese reviews of the game that I saw critiqued the art style as quite bad, to the point of being a little mean about it. I saw one person note the art style as being so bad it wouldn't even make it into a self-published comic. I, on the other hand, feel as though the art style has aged like wine, evoking a truly unique fusion of professional Japanese animation and a surprisingly high-quality Newgrounds animation from the early 2000s. Like, okay, yes, the proportions aren't always great, and there are all sorts of classics of amateur animation present here, but through the lens of someone seeing the game over 2 decades later, this ultimately gives the game a lot of character. I can't immediately think of another professionally produced game that looks like it, so it stands out in its own way and honestly feels kind of nostalgic. I do want to mention that while this game is only in Japanese, since it's a relatively uncomplicated action game, it can still more or less be played without Japanese knowledge. If what you're seeing here interests you, I recommend giving it a try. However, I couldn't find a great English language resource for the game's controls, so I'm going to go over them real quick here. I'll need to lay these things out to talk about them in greater detail anyway. As you might expect, left and right on the D-pad move your character, and you can also press down to crouch. Double tapping a movement direction initiates a dash. X is the jump button, and it can be pressed a second time in midair for a double jump. Square is your attack button. For most characters, tapping it repeatedly prompts a combo string. Pressing triangle unleashes a shmup-style bomb, which clears all enemies from the screen, and uses up one of a limited number of bombs. Holding circle allows your character to guard attacks from the front, which reduces or nullifies damage depending on who you're playing. Certain characters can also guard in midair. In addition, every character can perform a crouching attack, a jumping attack or jump combo, and a dash attack. Specific characters can also perform a downward directional midair attack. Finally, the shoulder buttons go generally unused, but specifically for Haruna, L2, R1, and R2 can be tapped repeatedly to perform a combo. And there you have it. Tenshi's controls are pretty straightforward, a suitable fit for the rest of the game, which is also fairly straightforward. Each level does have its own unique structure, and generally at least one or two defining characteristics, but enemies themselves can generally all be dispatched in about the same way, and the game rarely asks very much of your platforming prowess. This game tends to lean on its tone, its visual variety, and its brisk pace to stay engaging over the course of its roughly 1 to 2 hour duration. And brisk it is! Every level comes equipped with a timer that constantly pushes you forward, and the player character's run speed is blisteringly fast, which might be why the game is titled what it is. In general, the sprinting speed feels like it's intended for a player who already knows the game. Threats become much more difficult to avoid when running, and due to the fast scroll speed and a relatively low level of air control, precise platforming is nearly impossible. One thing I do think was wise at least is that the camera gently pulls back whenever the player begins sprinting. The visuals do take a bit of a hit for this since the game uses sprite work, but overall I'd say it's worth it. What I'm less convinced by is the decision for the sprint to be activated with a double tap. I have a tendency to not be very fond of double tap inputs in general. For one thing, they're not super great for accessibility, but even aside from that, context-based inputs like this have a tendency to feel somewhat inconsistent. One example, likely known to many people who've had to deal with double tap inputs for dashing, is the case where they'll be trying to move their character precisely using small taps when near a ledge, and then they will tap slightly too fast, the game will read it as a double tap, and the player character will go flying off the ledge, very likely into a bottomless pit. Granted, it's not quite that bad in Tenshi. Smartly, the sprint has some acceleration to it, which, on top of preventing players from launching themselves into the abyss, makes maintaining your momentum through any given stage feel great and lends the player character a solid sense of weight. Also, even bottomless pits only slightly damage you rather than killing you outright. Ultimately though, I just don't really like how running with a double tap feels, and like, you guys had an entire extra shoulder button left over, you really couldn't have used that? Maybe it's like fighting game commands, where the input taking sometimes is on purpose. Whatever, anyway. One other thing that drove me a little crazy when it came to sprinting was the either complete lack of or just very minimal buffer window on jumps from ledges. Typically people call this coyote time. I kind of hate that for reasons I can't really articulate, but basically whenever I was sprinting, it always felt like I had to jump very early if I wanted to prevent my first jump from getting eaten by falling off a ledge. In the greater scheme of things, this is kind of minor, but I do still wish this window was a little bigger. I think it would make the game feel just a little more responsive when speeding through it. Anyhow, the levels themselves are not super complicated. Typically they feature a few different varieties of enemy, some bottomless pits, and maybe a unique gimmick or two. But again, they do manage to feel largely distinct from each other, and while this is helped a lot by the changes in visuals and music, I think this is mainly accomplished by the way that almost every level has a unique relationship with verticality. The forest has trees you can climb, the mountain features a steep ascent, and the terrain is more or less an entirely flat line. Then there's a cave level where you go straight down, and a cave level where you go every which way to find pickaxes to progress, and a cave level where you need to climb directly up with a tight time limit, and you get the point. Really, this is kind of the secret to keeping a platformer feeling fresh for its duration. Simply varying the direction you have the player go makes them use their usual tools in different ways, or forces a different approach against the same enemies, organically varying the experience as a result. Tenshi seems to know this, and its ability to wield its structural variety is probably its greatest strength in the gameplay department. Because, ultimately the combat's not really that much to write home about. There's a pretty solid number of enemies for the game's length, and almost every level does come with a unique boss, or even two, but again, many foes can be taken out in the exact same way, and it's largely up to the player to decide whether or not they feel like using most of their moves. Natsumi's kit has a variety of moves that feel pretty good to use, but her downward aerial attack can be used while directly overlapping an enemy, and it pops her up in the air slightly to keep her at a relatively safe elevation, making it by far the strongest move in her arsenal. Haruna, meanwhile, has her crouching attack, which unleashes a grounded projectile that deals just enough hit stun to keep enemies at bay, and for those that start getting too close, the attack can be charged to knock them even further back. Now, granted, these attacks are not silver bullets, and there are definitely enemies for which they are not viable to spam incessantly. Haruna's crouching attack, for example, is completely useless against airborne enemies, rare as they may be. I don't think this game is completely busted balance-wise at all. It's just not a particularly heavy game, and ultimately that's probably fine. Again, it's short, and what's more important is that it feels good, which it definitely does. Sound design feels solid, and attacks have all the hit stun and effects that you would want a good arcade brawler to have. And really that's basically what Tenshi is. It only ever released on the PS1, but the spirit of arcade games of the era is remarkably strong. Between the weighty movement, the chunky feeling combat, the score counter, the music, the multiple characters with unique movesets and slightly different stories, the screen clearing bombs, the rapid pace, the dialogue options that lead to slightly different gameplay outcomes, and the timer not only in levels but even during character selection for some reason, even though it resets if you make any sort of input when the timer is low enough. I don't know what's going on there. All of these elements in concert make Tenshi feel like a lost arcade game, or maybe even a game that was supposed to release on an arcade machine but just didn't for some reason. This too contributes to the game's charm. It's difficult to articulate, but something about all of these pieces, plus the game's extremely indie art style, really do combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Oh, but I mentioned those dialogue options that lead to unique gameplay outcomes, right? Yeah, I don't really feel like I see this in action games very often. And, it's really cute too. For one boss fight, the number of minions the boss spawns is directly correlated to how rude you are to him in the preceding cutscene. Or my favorite, in Ayane's intro, she can beg to be given a 4th bomb, when each character is usually only given 3 at the start of the game. I love it, it makes me feel like I got away with something. So, with silly dialogue options in mind, let's take this opportunity to transition into talking about the narrative side of things. To avoid getting into the weeds too deeply, I'll keep it simple. Set in the year 1799, there are 3 large companies that are feuding between each other, and the postal service that our heroines and their boss work for is owned by one of them. Kaisoku Tenshi has been in the red more or less since it was founded, so when a big delivery comes in, they jump at the chance and set out to complete it by any means necessary. However, this package turns out to be of great interest to one of their parent company's rivals, so our heroines end up needing to fight their way through a whole host of baddies in order to complete their route. And then, toward the end, there's, some kind of conspiracy or other, and also some kind of evil demon thing? I don't know, for some reason the end of this game abruptly became very difficult for me to parse. Either way, there's still not a whole lot going on, although maybe some of the things that I feel like I'm missing are details that are provided in other stories. Since we have the 3 heroines and also 2 unlockable characters, there may well be more that I just wasn't really able to grasp for some reason or another. In particular, the intro sequence that sets the stage for the entire game is voiced with no subtitles whatsoever, and was absolutely filled with vocabulary I simply did not know. It wasn't until I very fortuitously found a transcription online that I was able to make any real sense of it. I'm much better at reading than I am at listening at this juncture. Other than that, the game's dialogue is minimal and almost all of it has both voice and text, so while some rough language or just really odd jokes can result in a little bit of difficulty, I did still feel like I got the broad strokes. Giving life to the cast is an ensemble of professional voice talent. Thanks to the game's fairly trim amount of plot, the voice acting was likely able to be handled for relatively cheap, and so Tenshi is able to benefit from the extra energy gained from having voiced dialogue. This has been something I've come around to over maybe the last 5 years or so, but man, voice acting really helps like most games. That extra human touch brings just a little more life to every character, makes them feel a bit more solid, fills out nuances that the script alone may struggle to. Even for players who can't understand Japanese, voice enables them to intuit a lot more of the emotion in a scene than text alone would be able to. Nowadays, I think I feel a lot more of the value of a solid voiceover. I would almost say it's a shame it's so expensive to include, but also it absolutely should be. These people work hard and add a lot of value and they need to be paid. One particular impression that stuck out to me came from the one English language review of the game I saw, which commented that the voice acting sounded like it was done by the programmers' wives, which just felt wrong on face value. Like, the performances are very silly, yes, but they use audibly professional equipment, and these women just sound like actors? Like, they have the energy that you would expect an actor to have? And indeed, when I went to look up the 3 main heroines, all 3 of them are voiced by established voice actresses. Relatively early in their careers for some, yes, but absolutely not without prior experience. Sorry, I know this is a completely irrelevant thing to complain about, and I'll grant that it would definitely be possible to feel like this game's voice acting is cringe. But for me, their dedication to the bit really does help lend a good amount of energy to the game's fairly threadbare plot, so the dismissal of this obviously professional work annoys me for that and other reasons I'm not entirely sure of. I think the last thing on my mind for this game is that it stirred a very interesting feeling in me while I was playing it. See, the last game I worked on was Freedom Planet 2, a high-speed platformer with an emphasis on simple but effective combat, and the game I'm working on right now is much the same. As I played Tenshi, I could feel my brain echoing the thought process that I would go through when I would play a level for the first time in preparation for balancing it and adjusting various other things, and I kind of realized that Tenshi is more or less an ancestor of these games I've been working on. Like, obviously Gunstar Heroes was and still is a major inspiration for Sabrina Diderot's games, so it would make sense that Tenshi, which is also a beat-em-up mixed with a platformer, would have a little bit of that genre through line. But I don't know, it's really hard to put into words exactly what this feeling is. There's just something about the game that makes what I'm doing feel more connected to the zeitgeist of this medium in some way or another. Anyway, I could always say more, but I think I've had my fill of yapping about this particular game. It's stupid, and it's fun. I say and, not but, because these 2 elements are not in conflict, they are in harmony. Kaisoku Tenshi revels in the fact that it is a silly game with a silly plot and a silly art style and silly voice acting, and it has no desire to be anything else. It is cringe, and it is free, and for that I'm glad I played it. Bye-bye.